I was standing on the fringes of that massive rally in central London last September, surrounded by nearly 100,000 people. I struck up a conversation with a man named David. He didn't look like a hardened extremist. He looked exhausted. He spoke quietly at first, telling me about his reality. He'd been laid off from a manufacturing job he'd held for 20 years, and with the cost of living spiking, he was genuinely terrified he was going to lose his house. He frankly admitted he felt like his life was spiraling out of control, like he was staring into an abyss. But then the atmosphere shifted. A speaker took the stage, and David's quiet desperation instantly morphed into something else entirely. The man who had just been tearing up about his mortgage suddenly flushed with aggressive energy. He wasn't screaming about interest rates or corporate layoffs anymore. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger toward a group of counter protesters and shouted that they were the infection destroying the country. It was a jarring, almost illogical pivot. He was drowning in economic anxiety, yet his life raft was a sudden, fierce hatred of immigrants. That disconnect between the real source of his fear and the target of his rage was startling. It wasn't just racism, it felt like a psychological defense mechanism kicking in real time. It made me wonder, was this anger actually about politics? Or was he unconsciously trying to manage a much deeper existential terror by clinging to the one thing that made him feel safe?
That's such a powerful story. And it's the perfect window into this whole topic, really. What you saw wasn't just a political shift.
No, it felt deeper than that.
It was a psychological trajectory. You witnessed in real time the journey from personal precarity to prejudice. When your life feels like it's completely out of control, that abyss you mentioned, the human mind just scrambles for something, anything that feels solid.
A life raft.
Exactly. And in that moment, for him, hatred became the life raft. It was a way to deflect this massive internal instability onto a very clear, very simple external target.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into in this deep dive. We want to unpack the science behind that pivot you just described.
Right.
We're going to try and understand how these really deep underlying fears, especially the big one, the fear of death, can basically hijack our political thinking. Yeah. How it makes people trade complicated economic solutions for the emotional security of having a clear enemy.
And we'll look at the theories that explain it, the political structures that feed on that fear, and of course, how our modern media landscape just pours gasoline on the whole fire.
So let's start at the very beginning, the root of it all, this idea of the existential anchor, which brings us to something called terror management theory.
To really get at the politics of fear, you have to start with terror management theory, or TMT. It's all based on the work of Ernest Becker, and it starts from a really simple, but honestly a pretty terrifying premise.
Which is?
That we humans are unique. Our big, complex brains give us this amazing ability to think about the past and future, but they also give us something no other animal has. The full conscious awareness that we are going to die.
It's the ultimate paradox of evolution, isn't it? We get smart enough to realize that our own existence is temporary.
Exactly. And that awareness, just the knowledge that we will cease to exist, generates this deep, underlying, and potentially paralyzing terror, an existential terror.
So if we can't get rid of the knowledge, we have to develop ways to cope with the terror. Psychological defenses.
That's the core idea of TMT. We build these huge, elaborate psychological structures to act as anxiety buffers. They keep that terror buried so we can function day to day.
And there are two main buffers, right?
Two primary ones, and they're deeply connected. The first is the cultural worldview.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's the shared reality you live in. It could be your nationality, your political ideology, your religion, your family. It's the whole socially constructed system that gives life meaning and structure and a sense of stability.
It tells you the world isn't just random chaos.
Precisely. And crucially, it offers a promise of transcending your own individual death.
Yeah.
Either literally, through belief in an afterlife, or symbolically.
Symbolically how?
By being part of something that will outlast you. A great nation, a culture that endures, even just leaving a legacy for your family. It lets you feel like you're part of something permanent.
So that's the big societal safety net. What about the second buffer?
The second one is self-esteem. But TMT defines it in a very specific way. It's not just feeling good about yourself. It's the belief that you are a valuable, contributing member of that cultural worldview.
So it's about living up to the standards of the system.
Yes. When you feel like you're a good American, or a devout Christian, or a successful professional, whatever the standard is, your self-esteem is high. And that feeling confirms that you're meeting the requirements for that symbolic immortality we just talked about.
It keeps the anxiety down.
It keeps the terror buried.
Yeah.
So if this theory is right, if these structures are really defenses against death anxiety, then there has to be a testable prediction.
And that's the mortality salience hypothesis.
Exactly, the MS hypothesis.
Yeah.
It predicts that if you remind people of their own inevitable death, you'll trigger them to intensify their efforts to defend those psychological buffers.
They'll cling harder to their worldview and their source of self-esteem.
They double down.
And the research here is really specific, which I think is important. The effect is strongest when it's about personal mortality, right? Not just death in general or some other bad thing like, say, failing an exam or feeling pain.
That distinction is absolutely critical. Because if just thinking about anything bad, public speaking, dental surgery, whatever, caused the same effect, then TMT would just be another theory about general stress.
But it's not.
No. The research shows, again and again, that there's something uniquely powerful about reminders of your own personal end. Things like writing about what will happen to your body after you die. That's what triggers these very specific ideological defenses.
And the reaction isn't always immediate. There's this idea called the dual process model.
Yes, and this is key to understanding how political aggression can sort of bubble up later. When you're first confronted with a thought of death, right in your face, you engage in what are called proximal defenses.
Proximal meaning close by.
Right. Immediate conscious stuff. You actively suppress the thought. You say, I'm not going to think about that. Or you distract yourself, focus on being healthy, things like that. You just push it away.
But just pushing a thought away doesn't make it disappear.
No, it just goes underground.
Yeah.
So after a short delay, maybe you do a puzzle or read an article, that thought of death is no longer conscious, but it's still highly accessible, just below the surface. And that's when the distal defenses kick in.
The more distant, symbolic ones.
Exactly. That's when you start bolstering your worldview. It's the difference between saying, I'm not going to die, and saying, my country is great, and anyone who criticizes it is evil. The real political radicalization happens in that distal phase.
That makes so much sense with the man at the rally, David. The fear of losing his house was the initial shock, the proximal threat. But it took the speaker on the stage to give him a distal defense, a way to channel that latent terror into worldview defense.
And that immediately creates a worldview clash. If my worldview is my psychological shield against oblivion, then anyone who challenges that worldview isn't just disagreeing with me.
They're threatening my very existence on a subconscious level.
Precisely. And MS makes that reaction so much more intense. People become much more appreciative of those who uphold their values, the cultural heroes, and they become viciously hostile toward those who challenge them, the cultural villains.
And you see this in the lab, right?
All the time. After an MS induction, people will rate an essay praising their country much more highly, and they'll rate an essay criticizing it much more negatively. They'll even recommend harsher punishments for people who violate social norms.
You mentioned the study with the judges earlier.
Yes, the municipal court judges.
Yes.
After a mortality reminder, they were asked to set bond for a fictional prostitute. They set the bond nearly 9 times higher than the control group did.
9 times higher. That's staggering.
Because the prostitute represents a moral transgression, a threat to the social order. And under existential threat, the judges weren't just judges anymore. They became aggressive defenders of a rigid social structure.
So this desire for certainty and order becomes overwhelming. How does that translate into actual political shifts? Who do people turn to?
They turn to leaders who seem strong, decisive, and who promise to defend the cultural worldview. The most famous real-world example is what happened after the September 11th attacks.
A massive population-wide mortality salience event.
Absolutely. And in the months that followed, support for President George W. Bush and his aggressive counterterrorism policies skyrocketed. And the research that followed confirmed this in the lab.
What's really interesting about that research, though, is that the effect wasn't just limited to conservatives.
No, that's the key part. After MS induction, both liberal and conservative participants showed a significant increase in support for Bush. It showed the shift was primal, it was existential, not just ideological. When people feel their existence is threatened, they look for a strong protector.
But there's a nuance there, too. Later studies found that you can change the direction of that shift.
You can. It depends on what part of the worldview you make salient. If you prime people with the value of compassion or tolerance before the MS induction, what happens?
They shift toward a leader who embodies that value.
Exactly. In those studies, MS led to increased support for candidates like John Kerry or Barack Obama. So fear doesn't automatically push everyone to the right. It pushes people toward whatever ideology offers them the most compelling form of security.
So it's fear management, but the political outlet depends entirely on the psychological frame.
Yes. And it just so happens that there's a specific political orientation that is almost perfectly designed to meet this psychological need for structure and certainty.
Right-wing authoritarianism.
The structural defense.
Okay, so if TMT is the psychological engine, then right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, is the political vehicle that engine often powers.
Yeah.
And we need to be clear about how we're defining this based on Altemeyer's work.
Yes, this isn't just a vague term. It's a specific personality orientation that's made up of 3 interconnected behavioral clusters. Together, they create this really powerful defense against disorder, against ambiguity, and ultimately against that existential threat.
So let's break those 3 clusters down. The first one is authoritarian submission.
This is a really rigid, almost uncritical submission to what are seen as established, legitimate authorities. It's not about loyalty to a person, necessarily, but to the position, the office, the uniform, the institution.
The government, the police, the church.
Exactly. High RWA individuals tend to defer to those authorities, often without question, because the authority provides the certainty they crave. It removes the burden of making complex moral judgments yourself.
You just follow the rules laid down by the person in charge. The second cluster is the one that's maybe more visible, authoritarian aggression.
This is the willingness to be hostile, to be aggressive, on behalf of those authorities. It's aggression directed at outgroups or at people who violate the conventional norms of society.
And it's aggression that the person feels is morally justified.
Completely. They believe they're acting as the righteous hand of authority, defending the social order. And the research often notes that this aggression is targeted at the vulnerable scapegoats who can't easily fight back.
Like the immigrants David was yelling about.
The perfect example. The speaker on stage gave him the perceived authority, which gave him the license to unleash his internal anxiety as external aggression against a group that was already marginalized.
Okay, and the third piece of the puzzle is conventionalism.
Which is just a very strong, uncritical attachment to traditional social norms and values. High RWA individuals see change, especially social change, as inherently threatening because it introduces ambiguity. And ambiguity creates anxiety. They want the stability of the way things have always been.
And one of the most interesting parts of Altemeyer's profile of these individuals is their lack of self-awareness. They often see themselves as being very average.
Yes, because they're so committed to what they see as the conventional majority view, they genuinely don't perceive their own views as extreme, even when their demands for punishment and conformity are way outside the norm.
And that demand for punishment is a huge part of it.
A core feature. Studies show high RWA scores consistently predict support for harsher prison sentences, for the death penalty. They see the justice system primarily as a tool for retribution, for maintaining order.
And when the authority figure is the one doing something wrong,
they're much more likely to blame the victim. In scenarios like the Milgram experiments, high RWAs would be less likely to blame the experimenter giving the shocks and more likely to blame the learner for, not trying hard enough. The submission to authority overrides everything.
So let's connect the dots. TMT and RWA. The prediction has to be that if you trigger death anxiety in someone who is already high in RWA, their authoritarian beliefs should get even stronger.
And that's exactly what the research finds. There were studies using something called the Social Policy Opinion Questionnaire, the SPOQ. It measures support for policies that are explicitly authoritarian.
Things like
repealing same-sex marriage, cracking down on immigration, giving police more power without oversight. Policies that punish outgroups, violate civil rights, and uphold tradition at all costs.
Covering all 3 clusters of RWA.
Right. And the result was crystal clear. When participants who already scored high in RWA were reminded of their mortality, their support for these authoritarian policies went up significantly.
So existential threat makes them double down. They dig in their heels.
It makes compromise almost impossible. The moment a society feels threatened, a huge portion of the population becomes psychologically primed to demand more rigidity, more punishment, and less tolerance. Fear shuts down dialogue.
But as we said, not everyone shifts that way. Which brings us to another really important psychological factor, attachment security.
Right. Attachment theory gives us the foundation for this. Our earliest relationships, usually with our parents, create an internal working model for what security feels like. And that model shapes how we react to threats for the rest of our lives.
So how does a secure versus an insecure attachment style translate into politics when fear is in the air.
The hypothesis was that people with low attachment security, who tend to be more mistrustful and need rigid, predictable structures to feel safe, would find conservative and authoritarian ideologies more comforting under threat.
Because that ideology matches their internal model of an unsafe world that needs strict rules.
Precisely. On the other hand, people with high attachment security who are more comfortable with ambiguity, more trusting, more empathetic, would lean into liberal ideologies that prioritize collaboration and tolerance.
And when they tested this with mortality salience,
The data backed it up completely. After an MS reminder, people with low attachment security showed more support for George W. Bush. People with high attachment security showed more support for John Kerry.
so fear sends you running to the political ideology that feels most psychologically familiar, that best matches your deepest, earliest template for how to feel safe in the world.
It's all fear management, just wearing a political costume. And for David, the man at the rally, his economic terror probably tapped into a much deeper psychological insecurity, making that authoritarian message of strength and blame the only one that felt safe.
Okay, so we have the psychological engine TMT and the political structure it gravitates toward RWA. Now we have to talk about the system that provides the fuel for this fire, 247.
The modern corporate media. And to understand its role, you have to start by acknowledging what it is and what it isn't. It's not primarily a public service.
It's a business.
It's a massive, highly concentrated, profit-driven corporate system. And that structure shapes everything about the news we consume.
There are a few key filters at play here that determine what gets through. The first is just the sheer size and profit motive.
Right. The major media outlets are owned by huge corporations with interests across the economy. Their goal is to make a profit, which means they are very unlikely to produce content that seriously threatens the corporate status quo that they benefit from.
And the second filter is advertising.
The primary source of revenue. This means the content is designed to attract audiences that advertisers want to reach, generally more affluent consumers. Issues that are critical to the working class, like, say, corporate wage theft or the need for stronger unions, tend to get sidelined.
Because that's not what the advertisers are paying for.
And it might even alienate them. The third filter is sourcing. News gathering is expensive, so to save money, media outlets rely heavily on official sources.
Government press releases, corporate PR departments, official experts.
All of which reinforces the existing power structure. It's much cheaper and easier to report what the White House says than to do a deep, independent investigation.
So all these incentives push media away from complex systemic issues and towards something else.
Toward sensationalism, toward entertainment, toward conflict and fear. And psychologically, that constant diet of sensational, fear-provoking news acts as a population-level mortality salience induction.
It just keeps our collective anxiety simmering all the time.
Exactly. It primes us day in and day out for those defensive, authoritarian responses we've been talking about.
And you see this so clearly in how specific threats are framed. Take crime and terrorism.
The coverage is relentless. The focus on violent, graphic, and immediate threats is known to increase public anxiety. Every time you see that grainy footage of a terrorist attack from years ago, it's a little MS reminder. It keeps you feeling vulnerable, and it increases the public's demand for aggressive foreign policy, for giving up civil liberties, for cracking down on immigration.
And it's not just violence. It happens with public health scares, too.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the swine flu, H1N1, back in 2009. The media coverage was almost hysterical, constantly comparing it to the 1918 Spanish flu that killed millions.
Even though the health officials themselves were saying it wasn't nearly that severe.
Right. The WHO classified it as a pandemic based on its geographic spread, not its severity. But the media focused on the worst-case scenario, the potential for death. And that focus on mortality is what generates the anxiety. It distracts everyone from bigger, less sensational systemic problems.
Which leads to what people now call the problem of truthiness, where objective reality gets lost in the noise.
It's a direct result of media catering to our biases. It creates competing versions of reality, things that are factually settled, like whether Iraq had WMDs or the basic science of climate change, are presented as if they're just two equally valid opinions.
Which just reinforces the political divide. We end up arguing about what's real instead of arguing about how to solve problems.
And it fuels the whole cycle. By magnifying threats and sowing division, the media system, whether it's doing it on purpose or not, is constantly increasing mortality salience, which in turn drives the demand for the very authoritarian policies and political rigidity that we see on the rise. It's a feedback loop.
And the most visible outcome of that feedback loop is scapegoating. Which brings us right back to David, turning his economic despair into rage against immigrants. This pattern of economic hardship being followed by anti-minority backlash, it's everywhere.
It's a historical constant. The rise of Nazism in Germany happened amidst hyperinflation. The genocide in Rwanda followed a crash in the price of coffee, their main export. Today, you see movements all over the West blaming immigrants for wage stagnation, even when the data points to automation and corporate policy.
So the classic explanation is just frustration aggression theory. You're angry about the economy, so you lash out at an easy target. But there's a more subtle mechanism at work here.
A much more subtle one. It's the idea that an economic crisis provides a plausible rationale for prejudice. It gives people social cover.
What do you mean by social cover?
Well, think about it. If the economy is great and someone stands up and starts blaming all the country's problems on a minority group, what do we call them?
A bigot. A racist. They're easily identified and socially condemned.
Exactly. But what if there's a massive financial crisis and unemployment is high? Suddenly, the claim that they're taking our jobs doesn't sound so fringe. It sounds, to some people, like a plausible economic argument.
It allows the actual xenophobes to hide in a crowd of people with genuine economic fears.
It creates what researchers call a signal extraction problem. It becomes hard for observers to tell who is a bigot and who is just scared about their job. This lowers the social cost of expressing prejudice publicly.
And there was a fascinating experiment that tested this idea directly.
A really clever one.
Yeah.
They created a little story about a guy named Mike, a blue-collar worker who loses his job in a factory closure during the 2008 financial crisis. And after losing his job, Mike joins an anti-immigrant organization.
But the key was the timing, right?
The timing was everything. For one group of participants, the story said Mike joined the organization before the crisis hit, while he still had his job. For the other group, he joined after the crisis, after he'd been laid off.
And they asked people what they thought Mike's motivation was.
Yes, and they analyzed the words people used. Did they use words related to xenophobia, like racist or bigot? Or did they use words related to the economy, like job loss or unemployment?
And the timing made a huge difference.
A massive difference. When Mike joined before the crisis, when he had no economic reason, people were far more likely to call him a racist. But when he joined after the crisis, the use of xenophobia-related terms dropped by half.
And they were replaced by economic terms.
It was almost a one-to-one substitution. People explained his actions as being driven by his economic distress, not by his prejudice. The crisis gave him the plausible rationale. It changed how his behavior was interpreted.
So the crisis didn't change Mike, it changed how society saw Mike.
That's the crucial takeaway. And what's more, this effect was strongest among the people you'd think would be most likely to call out xenophobia. In the study, it was Biden voters.
Really?
Yes. They were over 50% less likely to attribute Mike's motives to xenophobia when the economic crisis was part of the story.
Wow. So the cover story is so powerful, it works even on people who are politically primed to be vigilant against prejudice.
It makes it harder for anyone to confidently label the behavior as purely bigoted, which means it's less likely to be socially sanctioned. The crisis acts as an amplifier, allowing real prejudice to come out into the open under the guise of economic anxiety.
Which means David's pivot at that rally wasn't illogical at all. Psychologically and socially, it was a perfectly rational strategy for managing his terror.
So if this is the diagnosis, what's the treatment? How do we intervene? The research, thankfully, does offer some pathways forward, and it starts with engaging our rational brains.
But that's the whole problem, isn't it? The response to existential threat is emotional and primal, not rational.
It is, but it can be overridden. TMT research shows that when you explicitly instruct people to be rational and analytic as possible while they consider a threat, the defensive reaction disappears.
So just telling people to think carefully is enough to stop them from, say, derogating a critic of your country.
In the lab, yes. When people were told to rely on their gut feeling, they showed the classic worldview defense. When they were told to be analytical, the effect vanished. It suggests that if our leaders and media encourage calm, rational analysis during a crisis instead of emotional reaction, we might be able to short-circuit this entire process.
That's a tall order, but it's a hopeful one. The second intervention seems to be about changing the worldview itself.
Exactly. If the worldview is our security blanket, then we need to weave tolerance right into the fabric of it. We need to make tolerance itself an existential buffer.
How does that work?
For people who already hold tolerance as a core value, Reminding them of death actually makes them more favorable toward people from different cultures.
Because they're defending their worldview, and their worldview is one of openness.
Precisely. They double down on tolerance. So the goal has to be to instill that value from the ground up.
Through education, through media that highlights the benefits of diversity.
And, most importantly, through creating situations where diverse groups have to collaborate on common goals. When you're working with someone to fix a problem in your community, it's a lot harder to see them as an existential threat.
That breaks down the us versus them mentality, which brings us to the final and maybe biggest piece of the puzzle, media reform.
You can't solve this problem without addressing the chronic MS induction machine. We have to find ways to reduce the sensationalism and fear-mongering that defines so much of the corporate news system.
So what does structural reform look like?
It means reducing the influence of the profit motive. It means more funding for independent, non-commercial public journalism. It might mean using antitrust laws to break up the massive media conglomerates that have so much control.
The goal is to create a media ecosystem that informs rather than frightens.
If you can lower the temperature, if you can reduce the constant low-level anxiety that the current system generates, you reduce the psychological demand for authoritarianism. When people don't feel like their world is constantly on the verge of collapse, they don't need to cling so desperately to rigid, punitive ideologies.
It all comes back to that feeling of security.
At the end of the day, that's what this is all about. The journey from economic fear to aggressive xenophobia isn't really a political one. It's a psychological one, triggered by a profound sense of threat. When we feel our world is crumbling, whether it's our finances or just our sense of order, we desperately grasp for something that feels solid and secure. And a crisis gives that psychological defense a convenient social mask, making it easier to express prejudice and harder for others to condemn it. What we have to remember is that fear, especially when it's amplified by media and authority, is one of the most powerful forces there is for shaping a society's willingness to sacrifice others for the illusion of its own safety.